Please subscribe!
Well, howdy, partner, and welcome to the Wild West.
And we have bad news.
Bad news. Bad news for Outlaws.
Yeah, because Bass Reeves is a good guy who stops the bad guys from doing bad stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and we're about to read his remarkable life. And get this.
What?
It's a true story, partner.
Oh, giddy up!
Are you ready to ride with the legendary U.S. Marshal cowpoke? I hope you are, because we're heading into the lawless frontier. Being a peace officer in Indian Territory was rough and dangerous. The area swarmed with horse thieves, train robbers, cattle rustlers, and gunslingers.
Those are the bad guys I was talking about.
Bandits, swindlers, and murderers thrived. Travelers sometimes disappeared, never to be heard from again. A lawman's career could be short and end bloody. So, Bass Reeves had a big job, and it suited him right down to the ground. Everything about him was big. Bass stood a head taller than most men of his time. He had broad shoulders and huge hands. Bass was so strong, he single-handedly pulled a steer out of mud up to its neck, while a bunch of slack-jawed cowpokes stood speechless, like this. Are you seeing this right now? Bass sported a large, bushy mustache and wore a wide-brimmed black hat. He rode tall, powerful horses. But the biggest thing about Bass Reeves was his character. He had a dedication to duty that few men could match. He didn't have a speck of fear in him, and he was as honest as the day is long.
Oh, I wish I could be brave like that.
What are you talking about, Doug? You are super brave and a superhero of kindness.
But Bass, it says right there, he didn't have a speck of fear. And sometimes I get afraid.
Doug the dinosaur, kid, here's the truth.
Huh?
Everyone feels fear.
Even a big, strong U.S. Marshal?
Yes, but Bass made people think he had no fear because he met the danger head on. Because despite his fear, he knew that it was the right thing for him to do.
So he felt fear, but did it anyway?
That is the very definition of courage.
Wow.
Now we're going way back to his beginning, his slave days. Bass spent most of his early years as a slave in Texas. Even as a youngster, his stars shone bright. Bass was sharp-witted, good-natured. People liked his pluck. Pluck, an old-timey word that means spirit and determination. He had a special way with animals, especially horses. While he worked, Bass sang. He sang about pistols and rifles and knives. He sang of bandits and killers and thieves. Sounds like he was singing country music. His mother feared her boy might go bad, but she couldn't have been more wrong. Bass took to guns like a bear to honey, but he always handled them with respect. He grew up smart and decent and had nothing but right in his heart. His owner, Colonel George Reeves, took Bass hunting and entered him in shooting contests. He liked showing Bass off. Bass impressed his owner so much, the colonel took him along when he went to fight in the Civil War. But one night, something happened that changed everything for Bass. The details are murky, but this much we know. Folks say the two men argued during a card game, and Bass struck his owner. And for a slave, that meant certain death. So Bass made tracks for Indian Territory. Indian Territory is what they called the parts of the United States that were not states way back in those days. Now we go to the section on his freedom and family. Only Native Americans were supposed to live in Indian Territory, but some Indians accepted blacks. Bass lived within the tribes, learned their languages, and perfected his marksmanship. As he roamed the frontier, Bass felt a freedom he'd never known. Still, as a runaway slave, Bass had to keep on the dodge.
On the dodge, on high alert, on the lookout, on guard.
Finally, the Civil War ended and the slaves were free, and it was safe for Bass to settle down. He bought a spread in Arkansas just outside Indian Territory, married a pretty woman named Jenny, and true to the song of his life, Bass had a big family. He and Jenny and their 11 children, 11 kids, worked the land and raised hardy livestock. Brrr. Bass's life was good, but times were hard for folks in Indian Territory. The vastness of this wild country offered countless places for bad men to hide. The territory became a haven for the West's most notorious outlaws. Notorious outlaws, you say? Oh! Settlers in Indian Territory had had enough. Enough! Even though most were squatters who had put down stakes illegally, they still wanted protection for them and their families. Now we're moving on to the chapter of his life as a deputy U.S. Marshal. In 1875, the U.S. government sent Judge Isaac C. Parker to bring law to the territory. People called him the hanging judge, and the mention of his name made outlaws who'd never spent a day in church whisper a prayer. That's how you know this judge scared the bad guys. The judge hired 200 deputy marshals to track down outlaws in an area covering 74,000 square miles, larger than what would become the entire state of Oklahoma. That judge was on a mission to bring safety and justice to the Wild West. So Bass Reeves was one of the deputy marshals he hired, and he became Judge Parker's most trusted man. There's Bass, and there's the judge. Bass was perfect for the job. He knew the territory and its people, downright handy tools for tracking criminals, and his skill with shooting irons was already the talk of the territory. Bass was blazing fast on the draw and as good with his left hand as with his right. He would say he was only fair with a rifle, but Bass was such a crack shot that he was barred from turkey shoots at picnics and fairs because it was unfair because he was too good and never let anybody else win. Like most former slaves, Bass couldn't read, but that didn't stop him from doing his job. Before going after wanted men, check this out, he had the arrest warrants from Judge Parker read to him. Then Bass listened carefully and memorized the shapes of the letters for each name he heard. He memorized the charges against each person too. Then he'd hit the trail. And even when he got 30 warrants at one time, Bass always brought in the right outlaws without being able to read the warrants.
You know, his job would have been a lot easier if he just read KidTime StoryTime.
Yeah. Too bad we didn't exist yet. Bass could be out manhunting for weeks. He slept on the ground under the stars and worked in bitter cold and sweltering heat. Like other deputy marshals, Bass traveled with a chuck wagon and a cook, vittles up, a guard, at least one posse man, and a tumbleweed wagon to transport captives.
Oh, I like that. It was teamwork.
He planned every capture carefully. When Bass caught wind that two outlaw brothers were holed up in their mom's cabin, Bass rounded up a posse and made camp some distance away. He knocked the heels from a pair of worn boots and shot 3 holes in a floppy hat on purpose. He hid his badge, handcuffs, and pistols under trail-worn clothes and then started walking alone to the hideout 28 miles away. Why did he walk so far? Because Bass wanted to be sure that if the brothers spotted him, they wouldn't suspect he was the law. When the outlaw's mom answered the door, Bass said he was tuckered out and hungry, showing the woman the bullet holes in his hat that he put there himself. He claimed a posse was after him, and she took Bass in, fed him some victuals, even let slip that her boys were on the lam. So when the 2 boys arrived, they agreed to partner up with Bass because they thought they were all going to be bad guys together. After some laughs, everyone went to sleep, except Bass. What do you think he's up to? At sunup, the brothers awoke in handcuffs. They were dumbstruck, but their ma was fit to be tied. As Bass led her sons away, she followed for 3 miles, calling him every bad name she knew. And take a look at the illustration, how tall Bass was compared to most people around him. On a different warrant, Bass pretended to be a farmer. It's like this guy is also an actor. He rented some scrawny oxen and a rundown wagon. Bass drove the rig to the hideout of the man he was tracking. He ran over a stump on purpose and got a wheel caught. What's he up to? Oh, you'll see. The outlaws came out to help. They just wanted to get him away from their hideout. And just as the criminals freed up the wagon, Bass jerked his Colts, and seeing that it was Deputy U.S. Marshal Bass Reeves, all four outlaws threw up their hands. "We give up, sir. We give up. We were bad men. You may take us to jail now." Bass brought in wagon loads of criminals, as many as 17 prisoners at a time. Now, being a church-going man, Bass reckoned he could do more than just put bad men behind bars. In the evenings after supper, he talked to the outlaws about the Bible and about doing right. Getting through to them was like trying to find hair on a frog, but Bass kept trying. "Oh, storyteller!" "Nope. Frogs do not have hair, Dill." "Oh, it's like you read my mind and took my question right out of my head. Yup, yup, yup." Now and then, captured outlaws tried to get the better of the Marshal, but Bass was tough and unflappable. One day, right there, while he was napping, a skunk moseyed into camp and stopped right next to him, and the captives that were chained to the tumbleweed wagons were throwing stones at the skunk, trying to get the skunk to spray him. But when Bass awakened, he didn't flinch. He reached out and gently petted the skunk. Lawman and skunk tamer? Extraordinary. Word spread that Bass was a square shooter, but a hard man.
Does square shooter mean that he could shoot a square?
It actually means, in the old-timey Western lingo, Doug, that you were fair and you were honest.
Oh, am I a square shooter?
The squarest of the shooters.
Oh.
Outlaws learned that when Marshal Reeves had your warrant, you were as good as got, unless you hightailed it out of the territory. One outlaw named Hellaby Sammy did just that. With Bass on his heels, Sammy mounted a swift black charger that outran the Marshal's sorrel. Whee! But Bass was patient. He would cross paths with Sammy on another day. Bass would get his man. Even the infamous bandit queen, Belle Starr, admired Bass. Belle was about as far from tender as boot leather. She trifled with the likes of Jesse James and didn't cotton to lawmen. But when she heard Bass had her warrant, she turned herself in for the first and only time in her long, lawless career. That's impressive power. Oklahoma statehood. This, partner, is the end of the line for the Marshals. Bass Reeves' life as a deputy U.S. Marshal ended the day Oklahoma became a state and Indian Territory ceased to exist. Remember what I said? Indian Territory was that land that was the United States before the states were all there. State and local lawmen took over the federal marshal's duties. Bass Reeves had served as deputy U.S. Marshal in Indian Territory for 32 years, longer than anybody else. In fact, he was the only deputy who started with Judge Parker and stayed clear through statehood. He'd arrested more than 3,000 people, got in a bazillion shootouts, but did he ever get hurt? Not one time. But after all those years, do you think that Bass was ready to hang it up and stop being a lawman? No. Bass bucked getting put out to pasture. He hired on with the police force in Muskogee, Oklahoma. Bass was nearly 70 years old and walking with a cane, but he still put the fear of God into lawbreakers. During his 2 years on the force, not a single crime occurred in his patrol area. His reputation as a tough lawman had preceded him. One fall day, Bass Reeves left work feeling ill, and 2 months later, on January 12, 1910, he died of a kidney ailment called Bright's disease. Hundreds of people, blacks, whites, and Indians, today mostly called Native Americans, attended his burial. A fellow lawman, Bud Ledbetter, called Bass one of the bravest men this country has ever known. And one white homesteader said Bass was the most feared deputy U.S. Marshal that was ever heard of. Over the years, the name of Bass Reeves faded, like one of those heroes they call unsung. But his story has folks talking again, talking about the big man who helped bring peace to a big country, Deputy U.S. Marshal Bass Reeves, a true champion of the American West.
Is he an unsung hero because he doesn't sing?
But the book said that he sang while doing his chores.
To be an unsung hero is to be a hero that history forgets or that no one talks about.
But now we're talking about him and we know him.
Oh, so that means he is not unsung anymore.
Yippee-ki-yay!